I've never been a religious person. That's not to say I'm one of those hardcore Reddit atheists or anything like that. It's just not something I've ever engaged in. And that's not uncommon for my family or where I grew up. Most of my friends and relatives identify as non-believers. Even the ones who don't, they rarely go out of the way to discuss or debate religion. But, like any other family or friend group, there are outliers. And in my family's case, my Uncle Elijah definitely fills that role. To say he's a colorful figure would be a gross understatement. Being the oldest of 5 siblings on my mother's side, he did a lot to set himself apart, and not always in a good way. Eli, as they often called him, dropped out of high school when he was just 16, and without his parents' permission no less. He actually ran away from home for a while. He fell in with a bad crowd and even had some run-ins with the law, but it was never too serious. Although, he was arrested once for stealing pumpkins from a pumpkin patch and trying to resell them on Halloween. To this day, I still don't know what inspired that scheme. But when he refused to come home after a year, he ended up joining the army. And that really messed him up. Now, I don't know the full story about what happened to him, but my mother and my Aunt Lily just told me that he came back different. Traumatized in some ways, but reinvigorated in others. And it's around that time that Uncle Elijah found religion, but not in a traditional sort of way. No one knows for sure how it started. Everyone in my family has given conflicting accounts. But, near as I can tell, my uncle got involved with this small town church. It was located near some old mining town that had been abandoned for over 40 years. But for some reason, people still lived there. People even seemed to move there regularly. My uncle just happened to be one of them. And after living there for a while, he really made a name for himself. And by that, I mean he became the loudest, most vocal member of that church. There are stories about him going house to house at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, demanding that they all congregate in the church for an unscheduled sermon. And he would lead those sermons himself, often ignoring the preachings of the elders, as they called them. It annoyed some people, but inspired others. And before long, those elders I just mentioned were out of the picture, and my uncle was the one running the show. As for what happened to those elders, well, that's a hard question to answer. I actually did try looking into it, but let's just say the more I looked, the less I wanted to know the truth. And for a while, Uncle Elijah didn't talk much with the family, but he still stayed in touch with me via texting and social media. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I never called him out on his eccentricities, or maybe he thought I was safe, that I was too young to understand his situation, and I wasn't in a position to call him out or anything. But whatever his reason, he often sent me these spiritual progress reports, as he called them. He even sent me pictures of how the church and the town were thriving. And, at least on the surface, he seemed to be telling the truth. He and the numerous members of that church, they pretty much rebuilt that entire town. It went from this outdated, rusted, backwater mining town to a place that looked legitimately nice. I mean, if you didn't know about the church, you'd think it was some quaint middle-class town in the mountains. My uncle claimed these were all blessings. Me being the caring nephew, I was happy to just give my well-meaning support. Now, I admit, it wasn't always easy. I was in college during much of that rebuilding phase for the town. And by then, my atheism was pretty entrenched, and not just because I majored in science. My overall experience with religion had just diminished to a point where I barely thought about it anymore. Aside from my uncle, the only exposure I got came from politicians pandering for the evangelical vote. I still never debated or confronted religion. I was content to just ignore it, letting its adherents believe whatever they wanted. That is how most well-meaning atheists deal with it. But most atheists, they don't have someone like Uncle Elijah in their life. And this is where things start to get weird. Now, while I'm trying to establish a decent career after college, Uncle Elijah's progress reports intensify, for lack of a better word. He starts messaging me and texting me more often, highlighting every major sermon, documenting every achievement, no matter how minor. He even starts sending me pictures of his growing congregation. And yeah, it was definitely growing. I could see a steady increase in membership. I didn't know if that was because everyone was having more kids, or if more people were joining from the outside. From the looks of it, it was probably a combination of both. And at first, I just figured my uncle was a really, really good preacher. But then, I started paying attention to the details of his preachings, and they were not anything like you'd learn in a typical Sunday school. For one, he didn't identify the church as Christian, Jewish, or any other mainstream religion. According to my uncle, they didn't believe in labeling their faith. He also said they had their own Bible, their own sacraments, and their own unique way of structuring sermons. And for the most part, it revolved around those divine whispers I mentioned earlier. And these whispers, whatever they were, they informed the congregation what was true, just, and holy. They told them which parts of Scripture had been corrupted, which practices were unclean, and which virtues were truly righteous in the eyes of the Lord. My uncle claimed he heard these whispers himself, as clearly as he'd heard any other voice. It's what led him and so many others to live by the tenets of their faith. And those tenets are mostly what you'd expect of a religious community. They're very strict when it comes to alcohol, gender roles, marriage, family, and whatnot. But the other stuff, the less traditional messages of these whispers, that's where it gets more disturbing. One time, this woman claims a whisper told her to jump off a cliff into an abandoned quarry. And she did it without hesitation, and with a smile, no less. And this was a woman whose daughter was about to give birth to her first grandchild. In another case, a young man was told to hunt down a bear with no weapons or tools, and he did it, also with a smile. He actually ended up finding a bear, attacking it, and getting seriously hurt. But whether by adrenaline or divine providence, he still managed to kill the bear. And when he ultimately died from his injuries, he was still smiling. But the one that struck me the most was the family of 5 who agreed to stop eating for 2 whole weeks. Seriously, the father claimed a whisper told him not to eat anything. And they did, and they all did it without hesitation, including their 3 kids, who were all under the age of 10. My uncle even sent me pictures of them enduring day after day without food. I actually watched as they all became emaciated, so much so that the wife looked like a living skeleton by the 13th day. Not gonna lie, I almost called the police when I saw that. But, like everyone else who heard these divine whispers, they never stopped smiling. Even the kids, who couldn't possibly know how messed up this was, they looked so happy. So, I was genuinely relieved after the 2 weeks were up. I even texted my uncle to make sure they were okay, and he responded by sending pictures of them eating again, looking like it was no big deal that they almost starved themselves to death. I still don't know if that family suffered any lingering effects, but that was also the point where I considered cutting ties with my uncle. I just didn't know how many more of these stories I could take. My biggest concern was that one of these whispers would tell them to do something really extreme, something in the mold of Jonestown or Heaven's Gate. I also wasn't the only one with that concern, because by this point, most of my family wanted nothing to do with Uncle Elijah or his congregation. I don't know what the tipping point was for them, but according to my sister, he brought some of his congregants to a family reunion while I was still in college, and a few of them were companions in the biblical sense. There are still conflicting stories about what happened. Apparently, Uncle Elijah and his congregants kept trying to convince cousins and friends to return with them to their town. At one point, he even took my sister aside, shoved her against a wall, and urged him to just listen, as if he wanted her to hear something that others couldn't. Now, there are likely details to this story that she didn't share with me, and probably for a good reason. But whatever it was, the incident effectively banned my uncle from all future family gatherings. My mother even threatened to have him arrested. And keep in mind, this is her older brother. Thankfully, it never got to that point. The only other detail that stood out was that when my Uncle Elijah left, he smiled at them. He even urged them to keep listening for the whispers. I'm pretty sure if he'd said anything else, my parents would have had him committed to the nearest mental hospital. While most of my family was content to forget about my uncle, I just couldn't. I felt like somebody had to keep him connected to the family and the real world by default. I worried that if I didn't, nobody else would. That didn't mean I wanted to get involved with him, this strange church, or his congregation. But whether by fluke or fate, two concepts that I do not take lightly, I ended up in my uncle's strange little mountain town. Now, I don't care how big an atheist you are. Sometimes it really does feel like you're meant to be somewhere, even when you try to avoid it. Now, I honestly had no intention of stopping to visit my uncle. I was actually in the process of moving to a new city. I had just lost my job, and I could not afford to stay in my apartment anymore. So I was banking on having better luck in a place further from home. But less than 100 miles into my trip, my truck broke down. Granted, it was old and bound to break down eventually. I don't know. This is where me being an atheist kind of messes with me. Because it happened just a few miles away from my uncle's home. I had no one else to turn to, nowhere else to go. So I called him. And before I could even ask, he said he'd be there to pick me up in less than an hour. He even had a neighbor tow my truck for free, saying he could have someone fix it up within a day. Initially, I was just grateful and relieved. I thought I'd be back on the road at this time tomorrow. But once we arrived in that town, man, I don't care how pious you are, this place turned the creepy cult vibes up to 11. As soon as I arrived in that town, the people were absurdly friendly. My Uncle Elijah must have spoken glowingly about me, probably because I was the only relative who hadn't cut ties with him. My uncle's companions, his kids, his neighbors, pretty much everyone there, they treated me like I was some VIP at a resort. That may sound all well and good, but trust me, the way these people carry themselves, I won't say it felt unnatural or forced. It was just like their brains had been rewired a certain way. They spoke to each other as though they were all close relatives. They all wore these plain but distinct clothes, kind of like what you'd see surgeons wear in an operating room. Most were very kind and soft-spoken, but they always had this beaming smile, as though they were in a commercial for teeth whitening or something. It was also nice and welcoming, but it still creeped me out. Even so, I was willing to overlook all of this because they were just so helpful to me. One of his sons had cleared his room out for me to stay in, despite me offering to sleep on the couch. The neighbor's wife also offered to cook me a full 3-course meal, something I hadn't had since Christmas. Even the town doctor, who happened to live just up the street from my uncle, offered to give me a free checkup. Having lost my job and my health insurance, that was pretty tempting. But I didn't want to impose. I didn't even expect to be there for more than a day. But those plans quickly changed after I agreed to join my Uncle Elijah at church that evening. This being a Sunday night, that didn't seem too strange. Even though he knew I wasn't religious, I still went. I figured I'd owed him for all his kindness and hospitality. But once I got there, I immediately regretted tagging along. This church, it was no quaint building on a hilltop, nor was it some massive fancy megachurch. It was actually this weird bunker that was built into the entrance of an abandoned mine. If I were to be nice, I'd call it cozy. But if I'm being honest, it felt more like a tomb than a church. Then there was the sermon itself. Yeah, there were things like hymns and Bible readings, keeping in mind that this was a very different Bible, complete with very different hymns. Didn't know enough about the church to understand how different they were. But when everyone just fell silent after the first 15 minutes, that's when I knew that something was off. Because if there was one common theme with this church, it was about listening for those divine whispers. My Uncle Elijah claimed that he had only heard them 3 times. Most everyone else in the congregation claimed they heard it at least once. But these whispers, they were the true essence of this church, of this whole community even. and every one of these sermons revolved around listening for those whispers, which meant standing in complete silence for nearly 2 hours. I was not sure what to make of it, but they must have done a lot to this place to block out any sound, because I swear, I had never heard this kind of complete, utter silence in my life. There was no air conditioning, no fans, nothing that could cause any noise of any kind. Most you ever heard was the wind, but this being an abandoned mine, that was still pretty limited. That level of silence really did freak me out, but me being a considerate guest and all, I didn't make a big deal of it. I just sat in the seat my uncle offered me, kept my eyes closed, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. Having lived in an apartment building with inconsiderate neighbors, it was oddly refreshing. But it wasn't supposed to be. Even when I opened my eyes briefly, I noticed people really stressing over this, as though they were really trying to hear these whispers. Some even resisted breathing too loudly. I was tempted to ask how they would know if these divine whispers were real, or how they knew if someone was lying if they claimed they heard it, or how they could even be certain that this wasn't just all in their heads. That just sounded too insensitive to people who had been so accommodating to me, so I stayed quiet. I would have been happy to just maintain that silence for the whole sermon. But then, through this deep, unflinching silence, I heard something. Or, more accurately, I heard someone.
You can hear me, can't you? I know you can.
At first, I thought it was someone messing with me. I opened my eyes and looked around, thinking it had to be a trick.
This is not a trick, I assure you. I am whispering to you, as I have done with many others.
I audibly gasped, which sounded much louder than it should have. It didn't draw much attention at first, but my Uncle Elijah definitely noticed. I kept looking around, thinking this couldn't be real. A lifetime of non-belief convinced me that this was all in my head. But the whisper, it soon became too clear to ignore.
Not convinced? Very well. Just say the word Miriam.
Every fiber in my being told me not to do as it said. For all I knew, I was having a mental breakdown or about to be victimized in some elaborate prank. I still don't know what possessed me to say it, but I did. I didn't even shout it either. I basically just said it under my breath. But when Uncle Elijah heard it, his face lit up in a way I had never seen before in any man, woman, or child. He hears the divine whispers! My nephew is hearing the divine whispers! Suddenly, that intense silence was shattered. Everyone in the church just lit up with excitement, sharing the same jubilance as my uncle. They all looked at me as though I were glowing or something. I was both scared and nervous. I was also confused as hell. But then, my uncle spoke again. Miriam, that was the name of my first companion, my first love. I never mentioned her to anyone outside our town. There's no way he could have known, not unless he heard it from the divine whispers. The next thing I know, everyone in this church surrounds me. So I'm feeling both overwhelmed and cornered. I don't know what to do or say. They all just look at me with tear-filled eyes, asking and begging for more of these revelations. I don't remember what I said to calm them down. But even before the commotion settled, I heard more. And at that point, I could not deny how real this was.
Tell them to start singing and dancing. Nora Godwin sends her regards.
This only worked them up into a bigger fervor. I later learned that Nora Godwin was a teacher at the local school. She'd been very skilled at music and dance. Then she broke her leg in an accident and died from an infection. There is no way I could have known any of that about her. I certainly didn't know it at the time, but everyone in the congregation sure did. And when I reluctantly said those words, they immediately did what I said. They danced, they sang. I won't say it was good or skilled, but the way they did it, going about it with such immense glee, it was a sight to behold, both remarkable and disturbing. And while this is happening, I am freaking out, like full-blown existential crisis freaking out. Everyone is now looking at me as though I'm some divine prophet. My uncle even comes up to me, hugs me, and rejoices. saying I'm exactly who they've been waiting for. The divine whispers were so rare and fleeting, it seemed like people had been hearing them less and less lately. Then suddenly, I come along and they hear 3 complete messages in one night? I tried to respond to that, and I tried to make sense of it all, but it just wasn't possible anymore. For the rest of the sermon, if you even want to call it that, everyone just kept dancing and singing. Everyone wanted a chance to be around me. Old men dropped to their knees and bowed with reverence. Women of every age offered themselves to me in every way, and not just in the way you're thinking. I seriously didn't know what to make of it all. But with that whisper, that damned whisper, I kept hearing it.
They know you can hear me, and you know it's real. Now, you are my prophet.
It's not a role I ever expected to have, or even want for that matter. At one point, I cover my ears and try to block it out, but it's no use. I keep hearing them. At times, I swear it was laughing at me, as though it took pleasure in my discomfort. Even with all the jubilant cries and singing, I had to get out of there. I needed to get away. Somehow, I managed to run through the crowds to get to the outside of the church. Were it not for my Uncle Elijah, they all would have chased me. I think he knew what it meant to be a prophet of this divine whisper. I wish I knew too, because what I learned next, I'm still not sure what to make of it. Eventually, I get far enough away from the church to catch my breath. I thought I was free, but even after I fall to my knees and cover my ears, I kept hearing the whispers.
You cannot run from me. The fact that you even try convinces me that this is the proper recourse. Everyone else in this town, everyone who's ever sought my utterance, they're just so predictable. They get one taste of my presence, and before long, they're deluded by their piety, deranged by their adherence, doomed to believe every stray thought of theirs is somehow a message from the divine. They inevitably become leaders, gurus, and conmen, exploiting the faith of others as well as their own. But you, a non-believer who dares to question his own thoughts, you'll ensure that this will be different.
I felt like I was going mad. I wish I was going mad. I keep racking my brain for an explanation. Everything from my food being drugged to fumes from the old mine. But every time I try to rationalize it, the divine whisper just laughs even more, ensuring I can't keep denying it. Now, what happened after that night, I wish I could reveal. But my phone is almost out of juice. The people of the town, they're already confiscating my stuff. And Uncle Elijah has made sure that I cannot leave or contact the outside world. He claims this will minimize distractions, ensuring I can keep revealing the messages from the divine whispers. And no matter how many times I tell him I don't want this, no matter how many times I tell him I want to leave, he says that I can't, not as long as I keep hearing the divine whispers. And damn it, I keep hearing them. The things it makes me say, the way everyone in this town reacts, it's only a matter of time before something goes horribly, horribly wrong. I know this because, believe it or not, I'm still an atheist. Even after hearing these whispers, that hasn't changed. Because even though I know these whispers are very real, I also know this. The source of those whispers is anything but divine.